United States, the land of the free, is particularly rich in museums. And that's appropriate, because museums are a means to freedom. Here we can move out of our own personal anxieties and disappointments into the vast and stable world of human creativity. So I've come to America to see just 6 of her many great museums, to delight in the most beautiful objects from all cultures and all centuries that men and women have fashioned. And now I'm in New York to see what many people think the greatest museum in the world, the Met.
Funding for this program was provided by the annual financial contributions to your PBS stations from viewers like you. Thank you.
New York can be a daunting place, and for the art lover especially so. With so many wonderful museums in a few square miles, it might seem impossible to choose just one. But fortunately, there's a colossus that chooses itself, set within the peace of Central Park. Museums can be daunting too, but the Metropolitan, one of the biggest museums in the world, does not daunt. It may be approached by a lofty flight of steps, but these are usually crammed with people, sitting, talking, eating. New Yorkers see the Met as a friend. The 4 city blocks of the Met house over 2 million works of art, covering 5,000 years of human history. Any one of its great galleries would make a program in itself. So it is with a pang of knowing what I have to leave out that I've chosen from the collection. The Egyptian galleries include an entire reconstructed temple, the Temple of Dendur, given to America by the government of Egypt. But for me, it can't compare with another Egyptian work that is not only small, but broken. There are some works of art that are so purely beautiful, like this Egyptian head of a queen, that all we want to do is just to look at it in silence. But there were 3 things that occurred to me. It's carved out of yellow jasper, which is one of the hardest stones known to us. And look at the apparent ease and grace with which that unknown genius has accomplished it. And then, although scholars still think that this genius lived about the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, they no longer feel they know who the queen was. And I wonder if the queen was, whether this is not just an ideal head that the sculptor made as the perfect ideal wife for his divine pharaoh. And then I thought, this terrible mutilation, the breaking, that happened hundreds, thousands of years ago. And we're perhaps the first people living at the beginning of the 21st century who can see that crack as something they can respond to. And because the world is clearly not what it should be. It's an aggressive, unloving world. We are frightened of perfection. And there are many contemporary artists who make things and then they break them and they twist them and they mutilate them. It gives them control. It takes that terrible fear of the unreality of perfection away from them. And so we can look at the head and admire and respond to the change of color, the polished jasper and the unpolished darker jasper within. We can see the contrast between the jig-jag of the crack and the utter perfection of the chin and those full lips. And this is a blessing for us, but it's also very sad.
In our Western tradition, the body is central. We can see this in the Greek and Roman galleries, light-filled and lofty. Here is the simple majesty of ancient Greek grave markers, such as the Kouros and the Stele. And here, in a later time, Roman copies of Greek sculptures, graceful and elegant, but lacking the nervous vitality of the touch of the sculptor's hand. Islamic culture, in contrast, uses nature, but not the body. The art that has evolved in Islam is wonderful, almost abstract, based on pattern and color. It is most purely shown in calligraphy, superbly ornamental writing. Believe it or not, this is a political document, a sultan's tugra, his stamp of authority. Political power at its most dazzling.
This is a mihrab from Isfahan in Iran, and the translation is prayer niche, but it's a special kind of prayer niche. It marks the wall in the mosque that looks towards Mecca, and it's meant to focus the mind with its beauty and enlighten the heart with its meaning. It's like a sort of door, and on the other side is the holy city. 3 different types of exquisite calligraphy spell out what a devout Muslim needs to know. He must be a man of God. He must profess his faith. He must keep the ritual hours of prayer. He must give alms. He must keep the fast of Ramadan and go on pilgrimage to Mecca. And in the center, that great inscription reads out, "For the devout, the mosque is home, a sacred home, and just being here makes this a sacred place." Now, if I feel almost trembling when I speak about the mihrab, what is it like to be so close to a page from the sacred Quran? Generously, the Muslims say that Christians and Jews are also people of the book, but their book, the Quran, has a much greater part in the life of art than the Bible has ever had. Because originally, the Arabs didn't even have a writing, and their early writing is as insignificant as ours is. And then they met the challenge of writing the word in a way that was worthy of the Quran, the word of God. And different scripts arose as different artists, different geniuses strove to meet the challenge. And here this wonderful page, which shows the calligraphy of North Africa and Spain, makes it blindingly clear to anybody how important is that sacred word. It's so beautiful with those arabesques, the natural form of nature, never straight but always aspiring upwards, and the intricate gold with which this line, this surah, is punctuated. And I was comforted to know that it's Muslim belief that just to be in the presence of these words is to become blessed and to go away closer to God.
Many of the masterpieces at the Met are religious works with great spiritual power. The size of the Met lets them have their own space and dignity. But secular works can also ask us questions at a similar depth.
Watteau is the artist of the wistful, of that something more, something beyond that we long for. He's a witness. He's never an actor in the scene. He looks on. He was a sickly man, always, and he died young, in fact, a year or two after he'd painted this picture, and he never seemed to fit in. Now, he painted happy scenes, but there's this undertone of sorrow. And one of the scenes he painted most, and in this one the undertone has deepened into real sadness, is things, actors, scenes from the Commedia dell'arte. They were a group of comedians who had stock characters but improvised the play every night. And this is Mezzotine. Now, he was the valet, the servant, the buffoon, who dressed up to the nines and never got the girl, and everybody laughed their heads off. Here, Watteau shows him. Sometimes it's said in the garden, but I think here it's an obvious stage set, and he shows him as he really is. Look at the difference between the girl with her head turned, the stage set girl who's a statue, the painting of a statue of a woman and so very removed from reality, and the real Mezzotine. When you get past the exquisite beauty of those clothes and the silly rosettes and the funny hat, here's a big, strong male. Look at the nervous passion of those fingers as they play the guitar. The great, strong shoulders turned away in pain. The neck flushed. You can see the 5 o'clock shadow on that big red face. And it takes a minute, really, to look past all that and see here is a man sorrowing. So Watteau asks, the great fat buffoon who never gets the girl, is it really so funny?
The Met also has Commedia dell'arte figures in porcelain by Bustelli, the sculptor for the Nymphenburg porcelain factory. Bustelli died early and penniless. I love him for the way he delights in the sunlit world of the comic characters.
Now, he started by making two large figures, Harlequin and Columbine, and the Met has the Columbine. Bustelli always worked in pairs, and you need to see that Harlequin is making a rude gesture to understand why Columbine isn't just twiddling with her hat. She's making an equally rude gesture back. She's making the Neapolitan gesture, manu cornatu, the horns. I won't sully your ears by telling you what it means, but there are contemporary equivalents. And then, having made these two larger figures, he embarked upon the 16 of the series, 8 pairs. And at the Met, there are 5. There's Pantaloon, the miser who's a lady killer and skulks round after the maids. And then there's Donna Martina, the doctor's wife, the only one who isn't involved in the amorous to and fro. She dances, but she dances in her own space. And she holds a flagon of wine, and you feel she'll pour out a cup for the others, but only sip at it herself. And look how magnificently Bustelli has seen that they've been painted, all gold and brocades and silks and satins, a man who had nothing but wanted his alternative world to be splendid. And here is a pair, Columbine and Harlequin. What the story is, I would really rather not know, but it obviously involves a monkey dressed as a baby, which Harlequin is holding and singing to, and Columbine whirls across to feed the baby with some gruel. Here you can see why when we praise the grace of Bustelli, we're not speaking about something effeminate. That's a strong young male body, an athlete. They're dancers, and they're dancing through life. The sun always shines, nothing really matters, all will end with smiles. And for Bustelli, this was something significant, and he shares that significance with us. I told you that was the first reason why I loved him. And the second is because he works in porcelain, which is a medium I so admire, and yet so many people don't understand its potential for a masterpiece.
Porcelain is sculpture in a vulnerable medium. Look at the grief on the face of this virgin, mourning at the foot of the cross, a figure Gucci made for the Capodimonte factory. Or this rape of Proserpine by Bruschi. These works may be small, but they're weighty. Both share the unignorable physical presence of all sculpture.
If Carpo had made a painting of Ugolino, we could in theory have just walked past it. But he made a sculpture, and it's invaded our space. It's physically present. And in a way, this is a work all about physicality, even metaphysically. It's a meditation on what it means to have a body. And it's a daring work, the work of a young, ambitious sculptor, because it's trying to tell a story, which is a hard thing for sculpture to do, a story from Dante. Just looking at it, this great man in agony with these dying youths around him, you might deduce this is father and son. And the way those bodies are all huddled together, clutched and intertwined, might suggest that they're in prison, because it's an imprisoning scape. Well, the whole story in Dante is that Count Ugolino was a count from Pisa who was imprisoned on the suspicion of treachery with his sons in a lonely tower, and left there to die of starvation. Now that's terrible enough, but the truly terrible thing comes at the end, when Dante says, for 2 days after the last son had died, Ugolino mourned, and then grief was less strong than hunger. In some cultures, cannibalism plays an honored role, but not in ours. It's the final taboo, the one unthinkable. And you can see by the way he's gnawing on his fingers, eating himself, that this terrible possibility has already passed through Ugolino's mind. Here's a man in torment, physical torment. He's dying of starvation pangs. Emotional torment, because here is a father, a big, strong father, who cannot save his children. And moral torment, because he has already faced the temptation that if he cannot save his children, he might save himself by doing the unthinkable. Perhaps this is one of the ultimate sculptures, something we can't like, and yet can't but respect and be awed by. It seems to me that this is the most eerie gallery in the Met. Of course, the museum is filled with galleries that show us strange and wonderful civilizations, but none is more strange than this, the Oceanic Gallery. The Asmat are a small people in New Guinea, and yet they evolved an intricate theology which is perhaps summarized in these majestic beast poles. They thought that no death was ever natural. It was always caused by a headhunter or a sorcerer. And before you give a sardonic laugh, just ask yourself, do you feel that you will die or just know it intellectually? And then they believed that when somebody died, the whole balance of the world was upset, and it was a duty to put that right. Now, when enough people died to make it necessary to get that balance right, men went out into the forest and killed a mangrove tree or several mangrove trees, being careful to preserve one root. And when the tree had been accepted and brought in, then the artists set to work to make the most beautiful pole that was possible. And the warriors went off to headhunt to keep that balance. And when the pole was ready, they brought back the heads and wedged them into the pole. And then there was a grand uninhibited feast from which it was hoped children would be born, again to keep the balance and for the blessing of fertility. And then this great work of art would be taken out into the forest and planted and left, because it had done its task. At the bottom is the peg, which will plant the pole. Then there's a tiny little vestige of a canoe, the sole canoe, which in a sense is the female element. Then the ancestors. And at the top, the great prow representing male fertility, and the end of the pole rearing up to heaven. They look so strange to us. And yet, don't we all have to struggle with the mystery of death? I think that's why, for all their strangeness, these poles make an enormous impress upon those who are willing to spend time contemplating them. Whenever I feel I want to indulge in melodramatic hand-wringing about 4/5 of contemporary art, I think of an artist like Balthus, who's major, who knows what he's doing. This is a masterpiece of his first period, painted in his late 20s, just before the Second World War. And when the mountain was first exhibited, it had a little label saying, "This is summer," the first of a projected 4 series on the seasons. Well, he never did that series, and I think you can see why. Because although this is summer, with all the harsh light and the deceptive shadows, his interest is in the mountain. And it's a picture of verticals, the great mountain soaring and the blonde girl echoing it, and slow, soft horizontals, which are emphasized by the sleeping girl. Now, what makes this picture so baffling is that although this is clearly a recognizable landscape, in fact, it was the mountains of Balthus's boyhood, the characters in it don't seem to form a narrative. We can almost write off the man standing with his back to us, remote on the mountains, and the rather gawky couple who are also not part of the story. And the real activity comes down to the 4 figures that are more or less in the forefront. 2 young men, both looking very puzzled and anxious. The sleeping girl in that extraordinary position, who's really out of it, she's the valley girl. And then the blonde mountain girl, beautiful and challenging. And I think that's the meaning of it. The mountain is always feminine, and the young man conquers her. So this is, in a most reticent way, a deeply erotic picture. And it's because it's so reticent, because nothing is spelt out. Nobody even looks at each other. They're all challenging in their own minds, as it were, that Balthus holds our attention, keeps us puzzling, keeps us looking, keeps us taking enormous pleasure in a picture that remains fundamentally baffling.
The Met has so much space that even when the museum is crowded, there's room to breathe and be still. You can stand in the roof garden and see the city, distant but familiar. You can walk in the Astor Court. There are the medieval galleries. The Middle Ages is perhaps the period of Western art that I love best. I'm beguiled, enchanted by its power and sweetness.
Sometimes I say to myself, oh, how I wish I lived in the Middle Ages. And then I have to remember that they hadn't got dentists and they hadn't got anesthetics and their sanitary arrangements were truly dreadful. But at least twice a day they washed their hands. And for that they used an elaborate sort of jug called an aqua manile. There was a religious type, which was only used at Mass, and there was one like this, a secular type used at table. And round about 1400, some sculptor in France sat down and had enormous fun making an aqua manile out of the story of Aristotle and Phyllis. When Alexander the Great was triumphing in India, there was a disaster for the army in that he fell hopelessly in love with an Indian lady called Phyllis. And his old tutor Aristotle convinced him with weighty arguments that he should dump Phyllis and return to duty. Now Phyllis was understandably a little miffed at this, and she decided she would teach Aristotle a lesson. So she set herself to seduce him, and she wiled and she smiled and beguiled until finally he was besotted too. And then she suggested to Alexander he should lurk in the shrubbery and watch how she could make the great Aristotle go down on hands and knees and act as horsey for Phyllis to ride upon. They were always jealous of Aristotle, but he comes out of the story rather well, because he simply says to Alexander, if a woman can make a fool of me, old and wise and experienced as I am, what can't she do to a handsome young man like you? It's an anti-feminist story, but all the more popular for that, I'm sorry to say. Look at that air of the dominatrix that Phyllis wears, tugging at Aristotle's hair and patting him condescendingly on the rump, and he turns that lost, foolish look towards us, begging, as it were, for rescue. So when the family sat down to have their hands washed at meals, they would smile, because this is a truly funny aqua manile.
The Met has such depth and richness in its medieval collection that it built an annex for it, a separate museum on the far northern tip of Manhattan, the cloisters. Every part of the cloisters is authentic medieval architecture, brought stone by stone from Europe to America. It's a haven of peace, and filled with works of, and here I'm not exaggerating, heavenly beauty.
The cloisters is radiant with medieval art, but the two pieces that are the most luminous and moving, their greatest masterworks, are the Campin altarpiece, in which in color and symbolism and sheer graphic strength, Robert Campin tells the story of the Annunciation. And then the cloister's cross, which has no color, and yet equally lights up the room with its pale, luminous glow. It's a cross and not a crucifix, because the figure of Christ is missing. And then the image that touches me most dearly, right down at the foot. Adam and Eve are climbing out of the pit. He goes first, of course, and she's reaching and stretching and struggling just to hold on and get there. What an imagination, and what an intensity of beauty. The Metropolitan is probably the greatest museum in the world. And I think this is its greatest painting. The portrait of Juan de Pareja by the Spanish painter Diego Velázquez, which he painted in Italy. Velázquez was only in Italy because the king wanted him to buy pictures for Spain. And while he was there, perhaps to paint the Pope. In Madrid, Velázquez, of course, was a big figure, court painter, recognized genius. He comes to Rome, and nobody knows anything about him. Now, I think in his well-bred, reserved manner, Velázquez was a little miffed at this. Nobody knows who I am. He wasn't vain, but he had a good sense of his own genius. And he decided to paint a sample, a portrait that would show everybody what he could do. And he painted his assistant and friend, de Pareja. Amusingly, almost incredibly, this man is still technically a slave. But you can see from the way Velázquez has painted him that they're equals. In fact, that steady look of self-controlled power makes one wonder who thought himself better than the other. It's a daring picture because Velázquez has, as it were, given up all the enticements of color. It's all darks, the indeterminate background, the black hair, that wonderful copper skin. Even the rich velvets of the sleeves are faint, they're dim. The only marks of color are that glorious white lace collar and the face, glowing from within with vitality and a sense of personal power. And these two, Velázquez and de Pareja, were very good at PR, because what they arranged was that de Pareja would carry the portrait round to every artist and hold it in front of him. Then he would lower it. And the man who'd been looking at the portrait would now get the full encounter with the man whose portrait it was. It stunned everybody. The verdict was, all other painting is art, but this is truth. Years ago, my sister, who loves ancient Egypt as much as I love ancient China, told me the story of Hatshepsut. And because she's a great raconteur, and raconteurs exaggerate, I didn't quite believe her. But it was absolutely true. There really was a female pharaoh called Hatshepsut. She was one of the most extraordinary women who's ever lived. And everything in this room is a statue of her, a merest fragment of what once filled the land of Egypt. Now, she started off quite conventionally, but she wanted more. We don't know why she suddenly decided to go for gold, to be king, not queen. What makes this so extraordinary was that the Egyptian pharaoh wasn't just the ruler of the country, he was the country. The pharaoh was the only one who could speak to the gods because he had a seed of divinity within him. And if you had a bad or even an odd pharaoh, things went wrong and there was famine and defeats. So it was very important to Hatshepsut to show that she was a perfectly acceptable, indeed a superior pharaoh. She showed herself to her people in the traditional pharaonic garb with that little false beard and the pharaonic hats and the kilt. It was not, of course, female garb, and yet she never pretended to be a male. She was a female pharaoh, and she did very well at it. She filled the country with wonderful works of art, mostly in her own honor, and she built one of the most beautiful temples of antiquity to herself on the banks of the Nile. And she said, "The king Hatshepsut, she lives, she lasts. She is full of joy. She will rule forever, eternal as the sun god." But of course, she didn't last and she didn't live forever. And after about 20 years, we think that she died naturally. Or who knows? Anyhow, Thutmose III now comes out of the shadows and he's pharaoh. And then, extraordinarily, there's a concentrated effort to wipe Hatshepsut off the map of history. She's taken out of the list of pharaohs, and all her great works are mutilated. The faces are bashed in. The beards have been hacked off. Those heads come from her temple. They're held up pillars. Her great statues were thrown into pits, where they have been lovingly excavated, put together, and enshrined. The best shrine, the greatest shrine, is here at the Met. And there's a pathetic piece of inscription that's left in which she says she loves to think of the years to come when people will look upon her monuments and talk about her. Well, the monuments are still here. They've lasted. But I can't help thinking how absolutely furious Hatshepsut would be.
Why have there been no great women artists? That's not me, but the provoking title of an article by the brilliant scholar Linda Nochlin. It's a question that arouses great passions in both men and women, and it's an interesting one. Were women left out of art history because they had a distinctive way of painting that men found womanish, or ignored just because they were women? Well, two paintings in the museum offer their own clues to this controversy.
This work came into the museum called by David, the great French, male, of course, artist. And over time it became clear to scholars that in fact David hadn't painted it. And for complicated reasons, it turned out it had been painted by a woman. And then it turned out that there were at least 9 women artists painting at the turn of the century in Paris, whose work was so good it was attributed to David. This is Mary Denise Villiers painting a young woman. And my guess, since she was about 26 when it was painted, that it's a self-portrait. Now, the interesting thing is this. When this was thought to be by David, everybody was in admiration of its quality, especially of the light, the classic grace, the sense of space, all of which, of course, is perfectly true. But when it turned out to be only by Villiers, then people noticed the weaknesses, that the proportions from waist to knee are not quite right, and that she's very cunningly managed to disguise the difficulty of painting the painting hand by sticking it down at the side. Mary Denise is concentrating, all white and golden and serious, on this business of painting. They were a family who took painting seriously. She had two sisters who were painters. In fact, the work of one of her sisters, Mary Metropolitan, hangs next to hers. But this is an even greater work. I think she's looking at herself in the mirror, and that's what she sees, the perfect glass. What we see far behind her is a couple in love, mooning, but all hemmed in with a great building on one side and a rail in the other, and a cracked glass through which we see them. I think the implication is clear. The life of an artist is far superior. But basically, this is a charming picture, and does it matter in the least the gender of who painted it? Look at this painting, The Horse Fair. And now put your hand on your heart and swear that you can deduce the gender of the painter. Moreover, if you'd actually been there to see it being painted, you wouldn't have been able to deduce the gender either, because Rosa Bonheur got special permission from the head of the Paris police to dress as a man. She was a very unconventional woman. And from childhood, she'd been roaming through forests, going to abattoirs to study the anatomy of the animals. And when she wanted to paint the horse fair, she convinced the police that the only practical way to do it was to come without skirts and a bonnet. Now, the extraordinary thing is that this didn't scandalize anybody. Queen Victoria invited her to come and visit. The Empress Eugenie went one better, went to see Bonheur herself to present the Legion of Honor. And when the President of France also decided to visit her, because by now this picture had been so successful, she was getting awards from all over the world, he insisted that she wear her trousers so that he could see how a great artist worked. Now, why they accepted this, I think you can deduce from the painting. Clearly, she's keen on realism. That's a real place in Paris. In fact, when the trees were criticized as being too feathery, she came back and repainted them. And they're real horses. But one gets the sense of far more than realism. One gets the sense of romantic love. She did have a live-in lady friend, but her real love was for animals and for art. She actually kept a lion at one stage, but it was the horse that she loved. And you can see it. Something about those noble creatures with their courage and their dignity inspired her. And in this glorious picture filled with light and vigor, one sees the triumph of both man and animal as they work together.
Don't come to the Met for a visit and expect to see it all in a day. Set aside a week or see just a little. There are so many areas, let alone works, I haven't had time to talk about. There's a whole wing of American galleries with their decorative arts and painting and sculpture. Among European paintings, I particularly regret not speaking about one of my favorite Burchels, his vision of peasant harvesters. Mesopotamian works, such as this head of a dignitary, or the famous little dancer from ancient Rome. The Met's sometimes overwhelming profusion is summed up for me in their paintings by Vermeer.
Vermeer is the most sought-after artist in existence. There are only about 35 of them, and 5 of them are at the Met. Now, 4 of those are classic Vermeers. A young woman in an enclosed space and light shining on her. But the 5th is this one, the Allegory of Faith, which one scholar has described as Vermeer's one mistake, and another has said a large and unpleasant Vermeer. And even the auctioneer trying to sell it a few years after Vermeer's death fumbled round and came up with a sitting woman with deep meanings depicting the New Testament. Now, what I love about this picture is that it shows us the personal Vermeer as nothing else does. Remember, Vermeer was a man who lived in a small house with his mother-in-law and a whole family of children, and he painted light and silence. Here he's showing us something of himself, because as much as his family must have mattered to him, perhaps his religion mattered equally. It was a time when Catholics and Protestants were at daggers drawn. And Vermeer came from a devout Protestant family. And when he became a Catholic and married a Catholic, they cut him off. So I presume faith was important to him. And when he was asked, perhaps by a church, to paint an allegory of faith, he couldn't resist, although it was utterly wrong for him. If you look at the painting, it's full of wonderful things, all the great Vermeer things, light shining on studs on chairs and the great curtain, the chalice, that great glowing crystal globe, and everything has its meaning. Faith is that woman emoting in the center, trampling on the world with the chalice and the crucifix and the Gospels. The old serpent has been crushed. There's the apple of the temptation. He's worked it all out in his mind. And he wants to paint it. But in fact, he actually can't integrate it, because large ladies feeling emotional are not Vermeer's thing. And I love the fact that here at the Met, there's such a richness that their least loved Vermeer can still be given pride of place. I love it. I don't think it's a mistake. I think it's a touching example of a great artist daring to be vulnerable.
Take a closer look at the works of art and museums featured in the program at www.pbs.org. The Sister Wendy's American Collection 6-video boxed set and the companion book are available from WGBH Boston Video. To place an order, please call 1-800-255-9424. Funding for this program was provided by the annual financial contributions to your PBS stations from viewers like you. Thank you.
This is PBS.